I'm a city planner in Copenhagen, and last month, an American couple filed a formal complaint with our municipal office because our neighborhood discriminated against car owners. They'd rented an apartment in Walkable for 3 weeks and were furious that the streets were designed for bicycles and pedestrians. The woman insisted this violated their rights as tourists. She'd brought printed Google Maps, directions for driving, and couldn't understand why half the routes were blocked by bollards and pedestrian zones. Her husband kept saying, "In America, we have freedom of movement," as if walking and cycling didn't count. They demanded we install temporary parking spaces for their rental car. When I explained that reducing car dependency was intentional city policy, she asked to speak to whoever designed this wrong because clearly someone had made a mistake decades ago that nobody had fixed yet. My colleague told them 15,000 Copenhageners bike through Walkable daily by choice. The man replied, "That's because they can't afford cars." He'd seen our bike parking garages and assumed they were for people too poor to own vehicles. They left a 1-star review calling our city hostile to normal transportation. My cousin works reception at a hotel in Barcelona's Gothic Quarter. An American family checked in and immediately asked where they should park their SUV for the week. He explained the Gothic Quarter was built in medieval times, with streets too narrow for cars. The father said, "So you're telling me nobody here owns vehicles? How do people get groceries?" When my cousin mentioned that residents walk to local shops or use small delivery services, the mother interrupted, "That's not sustainable for families. You can't raise kids without trunk space." She was genuinely concerned for Barcelona's children. I manage a bike share program in Amsterdam, and an American tourist returned a bicycle after 20 minutes demanding a full refund. She'd expected bike lanes to have stoplights for safety and was upset that cyclists merged into roundabouts with cars. She said, "This is dangerous urban planning. Someone's going to get sued." When I mentioned Amsterdam had lower traffic fatality rates than most American cities, she replied, "That's just because everyone here is used to the chaos." She'd assumed our infrastructure was outdated, not intentionally designed. I'm a municipal swimming pool attendant in Munich, and an American man caused a scene because our facility enforced mandatory nude showering before entering the pool. He'd walked past the signs, ignored the attendant's reminder, and jumped in, wearing his swim trunks without showering. When I asked him to exit and follow protocol, he said, "I showered at my hotel this morning." That counts. Explained it was a hygiene rule for all bathers. He responded, "This is a violation of personal privacy. In America, we don't force public nudity." He insisted German pools were backward and that chlorine made pre-swim showers unnecessary. When I mentioned chlorine doesn't eliminate body oils and cosmetics, he said that's what the filters are for. He brought his own pool science to argue with our health department regulations. He eventually showered but filed a complaint claiming the rule was medieval. His wife took photos of the signage to show people back home how weird Europe gets about normal things they genuinely believed. Mandatory showering was an outdated tradition nobody had bothered to modernize. My brother monitors public transport in Tokyo, and he watched an American woman argue with passengers on the Yamanote line during morning rush hour. She'd answered her phone and was having a loud conversation about her vacation plans. 3 separate passengers politely gestured for her to lower her voice. She responded by talking louder and saying, "I'm allowed to use my phone. This is a free country." When an elderly man pointed to the silence sign, she said, "That's a suggestion, not a law." My brother approached and quietly explained that talking on phones disturbs other passengers in Japanese train culture. She replied, "So everyone just sits here in silence? That's dystopian." She insisted that phone conversations were normal public behavior and that Japanese commuters were repressed. When my brother mentioned many passengers were resting or reading, she said they should get noise-canceling headphones if they want silence. She'd decided personal phone use outweighed collective comfort. She stayed on the call for 6 more stops while filming passengers who looked uncomfortable, claiming she was documenting authoritarian social pressure. She later posted online calling Tokyo trains unfriendly to basic communication. I work at a tourist information center in Reykjavik, and an American couple demanded to know why Icelandic shops closed at 6 p.m. on weekdays. They'd assumed stores stayed open until 9 or 10, like American malls. When I explained that Icelanders value work-life balance and family time, the husband said, "That's bad for the economy. How do working people shop?" I mentioned that most Icelanders shop on lunch breaks or weekends. He replied, "That's inefficient. You're losing revenue." He insisted Iceland's retail hours proved we didn't understand capitalism. His wife added, "No wonder your population is so small. People probably leave 4 countries with better shopping access." She'd connected shop hours to emigration rates through pure speculation. When I explained Iceland consistently ranks among the world's happiest countries, she said that's because your sample size is tiny. It doesn't count statistically. It brought their own economic theories to explain why our business culture was failing. The husband suggested we lobby for American-style hours to boost tourism. They left pamphlets about retail best practices on the counter. My sister manages a residential building in Vienna, and an American tenant complained that buildings in her neighborhood didn't have air conditioning. She'd arrived in July expecting climate control and was shocked to find only ceiling fans in her apartment. She emailed the landlord saying, "This is uninhabitable during summer. I need a AC installed immediately." When my sister explained that Vienna's climate rarely requires air conditioning and that thick walls plus strategic window ventilation keep buildings cool, she replied, "That's primitive. What did people do before fans?" She couldn't grasp that the architecture itself provided cooling. My sister mentioned that most Viennese consider AC unnecessary and environmentally wasteful for 3 weeks of warm weather per year. The tenant said, "So you're telling me an entire city just suffers through heat? That's an infrastructure failure." She'd assumed AC was a basic human right rather than a climate-specific technology. She bought a portable unit and complained about the electric bill, insisting Austrian electricity rates were designed to punish comfort. When neighbors asked her to reduce noise from the AC compressor at night, she said, "You should all get your own units instead of policing mine." She left a review warning Americans that Vienna lacks modern temperature control. I'm a waiter at a cafe in Paris. And an American family sat down and immediately asked for the Wi-Fi password before ordering. When I explained we don't offer Wi-Fi, the father said, "How is that legal? Every restaurant has free internet." I mentioned that Parisian cafes encourage conversation and presence rather than screen time. He replied, "That's anti-business. How do people work remotely?" When I suggested he could use mobile data, he said, "I shouldn't have to pay for data when Wi-Fi should be free. This is basic hospitality," insisted. Our lack of Wi-Fi meant we didn't care about customer experience. His teenage daughter asked how French students did homework at cafes. I explained they usually go to libraries or do it at home. She said, "That's so isolating. No wonder French teens are stressed." She'd invented a mental health crisis based on Wi-Fi availability. The mother asked if our no Wi-Fi policy was because of old wiring in the building. When I said it was an intentional choice, she replied, "Someone should tell the owner they're losing customers." They ordered 2 coffees, sat for 90 minutes without ordering food, and left no tip because the service was incomplete. My uncle owns a restaurant in Bologna, and an American couple asked if they could customize a traditional tagliatelle al ragù by substituting chicken for beef and adding cream. When he politely explained that the dish had a specific regional recipe and we don't alter it, the wife said, "So you're refusing to accommodate dietary preferences?" "That's discrimination," my uncle clarified. "They could order a different pasta if they wanted chicken." She replied, "But I want this one, just made correctly for my taste." She'd decided her personal preference outweighed culinary tradition. The husband said, "In America, the customer is always right. You'd go out of business with this attitude." My uncle mentioned the restaurant had been family-owned for 60 years, serving traditional recipes. The man said, "That explains why you're stuck in old ways. Restaurants need to evolve." But my uncle offered to recommend restaurants that do fusion cuisine. They said, "We came here specifically for authentic Italian food. Just not this authentic." They ordered pizza instead and asked why it wasn't cut into slices. My uncle explained Italians traditionally cut their own pizza with knife and fork. The wife said, "That's just extra work for customers. You're passing your job on to us." They left a review warning Americans that bologna restaurants refuse basic modifications and don't pre-slice pizza. I work at a brewery in Prague, and an American man returned his beer after one sip, claiming it was served wrong because it wasn't cold enough. I explained that Czech Pilsners are traditionally served cool, not as cold, to preserve flavor. He said beer should be cold. That's science. You're serving it at room temperature. The thermometer showed 7 degrees Celsius. He replied, "That's 45 Fahrenheit. That's warm. Beer needs to be 32 degrees or it's flat." Clarified. That would be literally frozen. He said, "You know what I mean? Near freezing. That's how you preserve carbonation." He'd created his own refrigeration theory. When I explained that excessive cold dulls the flavor profile of Pilsner, he said, "That's what people who can't afford proper refrigeration tell themselves." He insisted Czech beer culture was making the best of limited technology. He asked if we had ice cubes to add to his beer. When I explained that would dilute and ruin it, he said, "So you're telling me how to drink my own beer?" This is authoritarian. He demanded to speak to the brewmaster to educate him about modern beer service. My manager came out and offered him a different style. He said, "I don't want a different beer. I want this beer served correctly." Eventually drank it while complaining to nearby tourists that European beer was overhyped because they don't know how to refrigerate properly. Manage a traditional tea house in Istanbul, and an American woman asked for just regular coffee, not Turkish coffee because she couldn't handle that thick stuff. When I explained we're a traditional tea house that serves Turkish coffee, she said, "Can't you just make normal coffee? It's the same beans." I offered to recommend a nearby cafe that served filter coffee. She replied, "But I'm already here. You have coffee beans? Just make it differently." She'd assumed all coffee was interchangeable regardless of preparation method. When I explained that Turkish coffee requires specific grinding, brewing, and serving, she said, "That sounds inefficient." Regular coffee is faster, she insisted. Turkish coffee was. Overcomplicating caffeine delivery. Friend asked why Turkey hadn't modernized to espresso machines. I mentioned Turkish coffee was a UNESCO-recognized cultural heritage. She said UNESCO probably hasn't tried Starbucks. They ordered tea instead and asked for sugar packets. When I brought sugar cubes, she said, "Packets are more sanitary. This is a health code issue." She decided cube sugar was unhygienic, based on nothing. They left suggesting we upgrade to American coffee service standards. In our comment card, I'm a train conductor in Switzerland, and an American passenger insisted his rail pass should work on our mountain cable cars. When I explained that cable cars are separate systems requiring additional tickets, said, "But they're both transportation. This is nickel and diming tourists." I clarified that rail passes cover trains, not private cable car companies. He replied, "That's a scam. In America, unlimited transit means unlimited transit." When I mentioned American cities don't typically have mountain cable cars, he said, "Because we'd include them in the Metro Pass if we did. That's consumer protection." He'd invented hypothetical American policy to criticize Swiss ticketing. He insisted Switzerland's system was designed to confuse foreigners. His wife suggested we lobby for integration between rail and cable operators. When I explained different companies had operated independently for over a century, she said, "That's the problem. Nobody's fixing outdated systems. They paid for the cable." Car-Ticket filed a complaint with Swiss Federal Railways claiming false advertising on rail pass coverage. They later posted online warning, Americans that Swiss travel passes don't actually cover everything, and calling it European fine print. Culture. My nephew works at a bike rental shop in Bruges, and an American couple returned their bikes. After 30 minutes demanding refunds because the city is too small to need bikes. Expected Bruges to be the size of a major American city and were disappointed. They could walk across the historic center in 20 minutes. The husband said, "You advertise bike rentals like this was a big city. This is misleading marketing." My nephew explained that bikes let tourists explore outer neighborhoods and countryside. The wife replied, "But we came to see Bruges, not random suburbs. When he mentioned the historic center was the main attraction, she said, "So you're telling us we wasted money on bikes for a town that fits on 2 streets? That's a scam." They'd assumed European cities were geographically comparable to American sprawl. The husband said, "In America, cities are properly sized. You'd need a car here if it was built right." My nephew mentioned Bruges was a medieval city designed centuries before cars. The man replied, "That explains the layout problems. Someone should redesign this." They wanted compensation for false expectations about city size. I work border control at the Resund Bridge between Denmark and Sweden, and an American driver was furious that crossing the bridge required a toll. He'd assumed European borders were completely open because of the EU. When I explained that bridge maintenance requires payment, he said, "But there's no border checkpoint. Why am I paying if nobody's checking anything?" I clarified the toll was for infrastructure, not border control. He replied, "That's double taxation. I already paid road tax in my rental." When I mentioned the toll specifically maintains the bridge, he said bridges should be public goods. This is privatization gone wrong. Insisted American bridges were properly funded through taxes and didn't require tolls. I noted many American bridges and tunnels charge tolls. He said, "Only in corrupt cities. Normal places have free bridges." He decided toll bridges indicated failed governance. He asked if he could just drive fast and not pay, since there's no gate. When I explained automated cameras would find him, he said, "So, it's a surveillance state situation." He paid but called it authoritarian infrastructure. Funding. He later posted that the bridge was a tourist trap disguised as transportation. My cousin manages language classes in Barcelona, and an American student complained that our Catalan courses didn't just teach Spanish. She'd enrolled specifically in Catalan classes but expected them to be interchangeable with Spanish. When the instructor spoke only Catalan during immersion sessions, she said, "This is inefficient. Everyone here speaks Spanish anyway. Why waste time on a dialect?" The instructor explained Catalan was a distinct language, not a Spanish dialect, with 11 million speakers. She replied, "But Spanish is more useful globally. You should focus on that." She decided usefulness determined which languages deserved teaching. When my cousin mentioned that many Catalans prefer speaking Catalan, she said, "That's just pride getting in the way of practicality," she insisted. Barcelona's bilingualism was overcomplicating communication. She asked if there was a normal Spanish class for people who want real fluency. Cousin offered to transfer her to Spanish courses. She said, "But I already paid for this class. You should just teach Spanish instead of Catalan." She wanted the curriculum changed to match her expectations. She left a review warning that Barcelona language schools push minority languages instead of teaching proper Spanish. She'd labeled Catalan a minority language, despite its millions of speakers and co-official status. I run a visitor center in Ljubljana, and last week an American man asked why European cities make everything so hard for cars. When America figured out transportation decades ago, I asked what he meant. He said cities like Copenhagen, Amsterdam, and Ljubljana were stuck in the past because they prioritized bikes and walking over vehicles. When I mentioned these cities consistently rank highest for livability and happiness, he replied, "That's because the surveys don't include car owners. You're selecting for people who already gave up on convenience." He'd decided walkability was a consolation prize for people without cars. I explained that many Europeans own cars but choose not to drive in cities because public transport and cycling are faster and more pleasant. He said, "That's what people say when they can't afford parking." He was convinced our urban design was driven by poverty, not preference. He asked when European cities would catch up to American standards. I didn't have the heart to tell him we'd spent 50 years intentionally moving away from car dependence. If you enjoyed these stories, there are dozens more tales of Americans bringing freedom to confused Europeans. Hit subscribe, and next time we'll explore Americans explaining tipping culture to countries that pay living wages.